Hey there and welcome back. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into something that might just change how you think about language. You know how we always hear about, language centers in the brain?
Right.
Well, get ready for a twist
Yeah.
because we're going to explore how parts of the brain we usually associate with very basic functions, things like movement, might actually be key players in how we speak and understand language.
It really does challenge the traditional view of where language lives in the brain.
Absolutely. Our main guide for this deep dive is Philip Lieberman's book, Human Language and Our Reptilian Brain. He argues that the old textbook view, the one that says language lives solely in the neocortex,
Mhm.
is way too simplistic. To help us get the full picture, we'll be bringing in other research as well, but first, let's set the stage with Lieberman's core argument. He suggests that instead of these neatly separated language centers, there's actually a functional language system, or FLS,
Okay.
spread across various areas of the brain. And, get this, it includes parts we inherited from our ancient reptilian ancestors.
That's right. Lieberman's concept of this distributed FLS is what really sets his work apart.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. What does this mean for you? Imagine this. What if the way we walk, grasp objects, even groom ourselves,
A lot.
shares a hidden link with how we speak and understand those grammatically tricky sentences?
Uh-huh.
Kind of makes you think about your brain in a whole new way,
It
Ravel.
really does. The traditional view, represented by models like the Lichtheim-Geschwind model, placed language primarily in specific areas of the neocortex, places like Broca's and Wernicke's areas.
Yeah.
These were seen as the dedicated language centers.
Right, almost like specialized compartments in our brains just for words and grammar.
Yeah, but Lieberman uses a brilliant analogy to explain why this view is too limited. A monkey protecting its eyes.
Okay.
Imagine something flying towards a monkey's face.
Oh, yeah.
To protect itself, it doesn't just use one isolated part of its brain. It's using a whole network of neurons, coordinating vision, movement, decision-making, and reflexes. Language, like this defensive action, likely relies on a similar kind of interconnected system.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Liederman argues that one of the key players in the system is the basal ganglia. Now, here's the mind-blowing part. The basal ganglia are part of what's sometimes called the reptilian brain because of its evolutionary age.
Yeah.
It's one of the oldest parts of our brain.
This really challenges the whole idea of a modular brain, the idea that everything is neatly compartmentalized. It's like thinking of the brain as a computer where you can swap out modules.
So you're saying our brains aren't like computers with neatly swappable parts?
Precisely. The brain is far more integrated and complex than that. And research backs this up. There are studies by Andruski, Blumstein, and Burton, for example, that show that even tiny acoustic details in speech, what we call subphonetic details, meaning the subtle ways we all pronounce things slightly differently, actually influence how we recognize words.
So even the subtle variations in how we pronounce sounds can affect how we understand words.
Exactly. And this challenges the modular view because it suggests that these subphonetic details, which were thought to be processed in one module, are actually influencing lexical access, meaning word recognition, which was supposed to happen in a different module.
It's almost like those tiny details are messing with our mental dictionaries. And speaking of mental dictionaries, this whole modular idea also impacted the field of linguistics, right? I remember learning about Chomsky's universal grammar theory, the idea that we're all born with a set of rules hardwired into our brains that allow us to learn language.
Yes. Chomsky and his followers have been searching for these universal rules that apply to all languages for decades. The problem is it's incredibly difficult to define those rules without a complete and detailed description of the syntax of every single human language, which is a monumental task.
So if our mental dictionary isn't just a neat list tucked away in one spot, what is it? How do we actually store and access words?
Think of it more like a vast distributed network of neural circuits. These circuits connect the sounds of words to the very brain areas responsible for processing our senses, actions, and concepts.
Wait, so you're telling me that the word jump isn't just stored as letters somewhere in my brain, but is actually linked to the part of my brain that controls my legs?
That's the picture that's emerging. And there are some really cool studies that demonstrate this. For example, Pulvermuller and Hawk found that when people think about action words, words like kick or grab, the motor regions of their brains, the parts that control movement, actually light up. Similarly, thinking about pillar words activates areas associated with visual processing.
That means even understanding the word blue taps into the same part of your brain that processes what you see. It's not just a word, it's a link to your visual experience. It's like our lexicon, our mental dictionary, is grounded in reality itself.
It really highlights how language is embodied, how it's deeply connected to our experiences in the world.
This real world grounding of our lexicon then makes you wonder, how do we use these words in our mental workspace, in our working memory? That part of our mind where we juggle thoughts and ideas, like when we're trying to remember a phone number or follow a set of instructions.
Working memory is crucial for language processing. Alan Baddeley's research has been groundbreaking in this area. He showed that a single system seems to be responsible for both storing verbal information and processing the structure of sentences.
So our ability to hold words in mind is directly connected to how well we can make sense of those long, winding sentences.
Exactly. And this has real-world implications. Studies have shown that people with higher working memory capacity, who are called high-span individuals, are better at using context to understand ambiguous sentences. They're less likely to get tripped up by those tricky grammatical structures.
This whole idea of working memory being tied to language processing is fascinating. It makes you realize just how much our ability to think and reason might be shaped by the way our brains handle language. But let's bring it back to the star of the show, the basal ganglia. If you recall, this is the part of the brain we often associate with basic movement and coordination. So how does it fit into this whole language system?
It plays a critical role. The basal ganglia are all about sequencing. They take individual actions and put them into smooth, coordinated patterns.
Kind of like a choreographer for our
A
movements.
perfect analogy, and this is where it gets really intriguing. Think about a rat grooming itself. They have these genetically programmed sequences of cleaning motions. It's like a basic syntax for action.
Okay.
And guess what? It's controlled by the basal ganglia.
Whoa. So even a rat's cleaning routine involves a kind of grammar controlled by the same brain area that's involved in human language.
Exactly. It suggests a deep evolutionary connection between physical sequencing and the sequencing of words and sentences.
That's incredible. I never imagined that a rat's grooming routine could offer clues to the origins of human language. But what happens when the sequencing ability gets disrupted?
That's where those experiments in nature come in, where we can look at cases of brain damage to see what happens to language when certain areas malfunction. Conditions like Broca's aphasia and Parkinson's disease, where the basal ganglia are often affected, provide valuable insights.
So let's talk about those. With Broca's aphasia, people struggle to speak fluently, right?
Yes. People with Broca's aphasia have characteristic speech difficulties. They struggle to sequence the sounds that make up words, which leads to that halting, effortful speech.
So instead of saying cat, they might say like CAT with pauses between the sounds.
Precisely. And interestingly, we see similar problems in Parkinson's disease, where the basal ganglia are also affected. Patients often have difficulty with smooth, coordinated movements, and their speech can become slow and slurred.
So in both cases, the ability to sequence, whether it's sounds in speech or physical actions, is disrupted. Does this point to the basal ganglia playing a role in both our ability to produce language and to understand it?
It really does, and there's a fascinating study of Mount Everest climbers that provides even more evidence for that.
Okay, Mount Everest climbers, language, and the basal ganglia. I'm all ears.
At high altitudes where oxygen is scarce, climbers experience hypoxia. And a study found that when climbers were at high altitude, both their speech sequencing and their ability to understand sentences suffered.
So even temporary oxygen deprivation can impact both how we produce and how we understand language.
Yes. And what's interesting is that other cognitive abilities remained relatively intact. This seems to specifically target areas controlled by the basal ganglia.
Wow, that's pretty compelling evidence for the basal ganglia's sensitivity to disruption and its crucial role in both sides of language, both speaking and understanding. It's like a reminder that language isn't just about knowing words and grammar. It's about our brain's ability to coordinate those complex sequences of sounds and thoughts. All of this is really making me rethink those old textbook ideas about language. It seems so much more complex and intertwined with our biology and evolution than I ever imagined. But I do have a question about something that's been bugging me. Lieberman argues that the human vocal tract, the way our mouths and throats are structured, evolved specifically to enhance speech. But wouldn't that require language to already be present? How could our vocal tract evolve for speech if we weren't already using language?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the debate about the evolution of language. The human vocal tract is unique. Our lowered larynx, also known as the voice box, allows us to produce a much wider range of sounds than other primates. Think about the sounds E as in sea and oo as in moon. Those are called quantal vowels, and they're key for clear communication because their acoustic properties are very distinct.
So you're saying a lowered larynx means clear vowels, which helps with language, but that doesn't explain how language itself got started in the first place.
Right, and that's the key point. It wouldn't make evolutionary sense for our vocal tract to adapt for speech unless language was already offering some survival advantage to our ancestors. It implies that some form of language, perhaps a simpler proto-language,
Right.
existed before our modern vocal anatomy evolved.
So maybe our ancestors were communicating in simpler ways, maybe using gestures or a combination of sounds and gestures, and as language became more complex and advantageous, our vocal tracts adapted to keep up.
That's certainly a possibility. It highlights how the evolution of language is likely a two-way street. Language shaping our biology, and our biology shaping language. It's this dynamic co-evolutionary process.
This deep dive is really making us reconsider those old textbook ideas about language. It's so much more complex and interconnected than we thought.
Absolutely. Lieberman's book is a powerful argument for moving beyond the idea of isolated language centers in the brain. The functional language system, the FLS, is a complex interplay of multiple brain areas, including those ancient structures we inherited from our reptilian ancestors.
So where does this leave us? What are some key takeaways for someone trying to understand the amazing complexity of human language?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that language is deeply embodied. It's not just this abstract system of symbols. It's woven into our senses, our movements, and our experiences of the world.
So it's like language is fundamentally a part of who we are.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for how we think about everything from language acquisition to the potential for language to shape our thoughts and perceptions. Lieberman even touches on the possibility that language might have influenced our evolution. He suggests that the very demands of language, the need to process complex sentences and produce articulate speech, could have actually driven the evolution of our brains.
That's right. He points out that the human brain is incredibly good at integrating information from many different sources. Think about it. We can effortlessly combine visual, auditory, and sensory information with abstract concepts and language structure.
Right.
And that ability must have given our ancestors a huge advantage in terms of survival and social interaction.
Absolutely. And it suggests that language didn't just appear out of thin air. It co-evolved with our brains, pushing us towards greater complexity and cognitive flexibility. It's like this constant feedback loop with language shaping our brains and our brains shaping language.
This is incredible. But before we get too carried away, let's pause here for a moment. We've covered a lot of ground, and we'll pick up this fascinating conversation in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back. It's amazing to think about language being this dynamic force that shaped our brains and continues to influence how we think and interact with the world. Before the break, we were talking about how the demands of language might have actually driven the evolution of our brains. Where were we?
We were discussing how our brains are remarkably good at integrating information from multiple sources: sights, sounds, feelings, and of course, language. This ability must have been hugely advantageous for our ancestors.
Right, and it suggests that language co-evolved with our brains, pushing us toward greater complexity and cognitive flexibility. It wasn't just a one-way street.
Exactly. And Lieberman takes this idea even further in his book. He proposes a fascinating link between language and movement. He suggests that because language and movement are so intertwined in our brains, learning a new language or practicing a musical instrument could actually improve our motor skills and vice versa.
Wait, are you telling me that learning to speak Spanish could make me a better dancer? Or that practicing the piano could improve my tennis game?
It might sound a little far-fetched, but there's growing evidence for what's called cross-domain transfer in the brain. This means that when we challenge ourselves in one area, it can strengthen connections and enhance abilities in seemingly unrelated areas.
So all those years I spent struggling with French verb conjugations might have actually been training my brain for something else entirely. But before we get too excited about becoming multilingual athletes, let's get back to Lieberman's main point, the intertwining of language and movement in our brains. We were just starting to discuss how this connection is evident in cases of brain damage. What can we learn from these experiments of nature, as you called them?
Conditions like Broca's aphasia and Parkinson's disease, where the basal ganglia are often affected, offer some really important insights.
So what exactly do these conditions tell us about the link between movement, the basal ganglia, and language? I remember we were talking about how people with Broca's aphasia have difficulty speaking fluently.
Yes, they struggle to sequence the sounds that make up words, which leads to that halting, effortful speech.
So instead of saying cat, they might say like CAT with pauses between each sound.
Exactly. And interestingly, we see similar problems in Parkinson's disease, where the basal ganglia are also affected. People with Parkinson's often have difficulty with smooth, coordinated movements, and their speech can become slow and slurred.
So in both cases, whether it's the sounds in speech or physical actions, that ability to sequence things is disrupted. It really points to the basal ganglia's crucial role in sequencing across multiple domains, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's not just about moving your body. It's about putting things in order, whether those things are sounds or movements or even thoughts. And there's this really fascinating study on Mount Everest climbers that adds another layer to this whole story.
Okay, Mount Everest climbers, language, and the basal ganglia. That should be good.
Well, at high altitudes where oxygen is scarce, climbers experience what's called hypoxia. And a study found that when climbers were at high altitude, both their speech sequencing and their ability to understand sentences suffered.
So even temporary oxygen deprivation can impact both how we speak and how we understand language.
That's right. And here's the truly fascinating part. Their other cognitive abilities remained relatively intact. So it seems like this disruption specifically targets areas controlled by the basal ganglia.
Wow. So even a temporary lack of oxygen can affect language, and it seems to be happening right in the basal ganglia. That's strong evidence that the basal ganglia is sensitive to disruption and that it plays a crucial role in both sides of language, both producing it and understanding it. It's like language isn't just about vocabulary and grammar, it's also about our brain's amazing ability to coordinate these incredibly complex sequences of sounds and ideas.
It is truly remarkable. And it brings us back to Lieberman's central argument about the functional language system, this FLS, not being confined to a few specific areas. Instead, it's this intricate dance involving multiple parts of the brain, including those ancient structures we inherited from our reptilian ancestors.
This has been an incredible journey so far, wouldn't you say? We've traveled from the traditional view of language centers to this much richer, more dynamic understanding of how language really works in the brain.
I agree. And we're not done yet.
Exactly. But before we delve deeper into Lieberman's fascinating insights, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back with more in just a moment. And we're back. It really makes you think, you know? This whole idea that even a temporary lack of oxygen can impact language, and it seems to be happening right there in the basal ganglia.
Yeah, it is pretty remarkable how this seemingly basic part of our brain, the one we usually associate with things like movement and coordination, turns out to be so essential for something as complex as language.
It really does. It really challenges those old textbook ideas of neat and tidy language centers in the brain. But speaking of challenges, I remember there was something in Lieberman's book that really made me stop and think. He argues that the human vocal tract, the way our mouths and throats are structured, evolved specifically to enhance speech. But how could that happen if language wasn't already there? It seems like a bit of a chicken and egg situation, doesn't it?
It is a question that has puzzled scientists for a long time. How could our vocal anatomy evolve for speech if we weren't already using language? But when you think about it, it wouldn't make evolutionary sense for our vocal tract to adapt for speech unless language already offered some kind of survival advantage to our ancestors.
So you're saying that some form of language, maybe a simpler version, had to exist before our modern vocal anatomy evolved.
It's a strong possibility. Think about it, the human vocal tract is quite unique. Our lowered larynx, the voice box, allows us to produce a much wider range of sounds than other primates. And certain sounds, like the E in C and the oo in moon, those are called quantal vowels, and they have very distinct acoustic properties that make them ideal for clear communication.
So a lowered larynx means clearer, more distinct vowels, which would have been very helpful for language. But that still doesn't quite explain how language itself got started.
Right, and that's the key point. It suggests that some form of language, perhaps a proto-language, had to exist before our modern anatomy evolved. It's as if language itself drove the changes in our vocal tract, shaping our biology to better serve its needs.
So it's possible that our ancestors were communicating in simpler ways, maybe using gestures or a combination of sounds and gestures, and as language became more complex and advantageous, our vocal tracts adapted to keep up.
That's a very plausible scenario. It highlights how the evolution of language was probably a two-way street. language shaping our biology, and our biology in turn shaping language. It was this incredible dance of coevolution.
This entire deep dive has really opened my eyes to the incredible complexity of language. We've gone from this idea of neat language centers in the brain to this much more intricate and dynamic understanding of how language really works. It's not just about words and grammar, it's about this interplay between our biology, our experiences in the world, and this deep-seated need to communicate and connect with others.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, it's not just about specific areas of the brain either. It's about the basal ganglia, this ancient part of our brain that we usually associate with movement, playing a critical role in sequencing, not just our actions, but the very sounds and thoughts that make up language.
It's almost as if language is woven into the very fabric of who we are. But I'm curious, for our listener who's been on this journey with us, what would you say are the biggest takeaways from our deep dive into Lieberman's work?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is this idea that language is deeply embodied. It's not just some abstract system of symbols floating around in our heads. It's intricately connected to our senses, our movements, and our experiences in the world. Even understanding a simple word like blue activates the same part of your brain that processes what you see. It's a direct link to your visual experience. Our lexicon, our mental dictionary, is grounded in reality itself.
That's such a powerful image. It makes you realize that language isn't separate from who we are. It's a part of us, just as much as our ability to walk, to grasp objects, to experience the world around us.
Exactly. And I think another crucial takeaway is that language is constantly evolving. Just like our bodies have adapted over time, language has too. And who knows what the future holds? As we continue to learn more about the brain and how it works, our understanding of language will continue to evolve as well.
That's the beauty of it all, isn't it? There's always more to discover, more to learn. Lieberman's book has certainly given us a lot to think about. But perhaps the most intriguing idea he puts forward is the suggestion that if language and movement are so intertwined in our brains, then maybe learning a new language or practicing a musical instrument could actually improve our motor skills or vice versa.
It is a fascinating possibility. There's this concept called cross-domain transfer, where challenging yourself in one area can actually lead to improvements in seemingly unrelated areas. It speaks to the incredible plasticity of our brains and the interconnectedness of our abilities.
So to our listener, I say this. Keep exploring, keep learning, keep challenging yourself. You never know what amazing connections you might discover. And who knows, maybe someday you'll be a multilingual athlete, all thanks to the power of your amazing brain.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. This deep dive into the world of language and the brain has certainly been a thought-provoking adventure. And I hope it inspires our listeners to continue exploring this fascinating and ever-evolving field. There's still so much to discover.
Absolutely. And we'll be here to guide you through it one deep dive at a time. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.